You saw what I did that night.
I came back anyway. Why do you think?
Because you know I'm the only one who can protect you.
Blood stained the pristine linoleum, but it wasn't the bullets that almost killed Boston's most feared syndicate boss. It was the betrayal. When a ruthless mafia don offered a 300-pound overworked nurse a fortune just to sleep beside him, she thought it was delirium. It was actually a life sentence. The rain in Boston that November didn't just fall. It felt like it was trying to punish the city. Inside the subterranean VIP wing of St. Jude's Medical Center, Beatrice Gallagher was used to the graveyard shift. At 32, Beatrice, or B, to the few who bothered to look past her size, was a woman who took up space in a world that constantly demanded she shrink. Weighing in at nearly 300 pounds, Bear carried herself with a quiet, heavy dignity. Her XXL navy blue scrubs stretched tight across her wide hips and thick thighs, and her orthopedic clogs squeaked rhythmically against the polished floors. She knew what the thinner, prettier nurses like Jessica whispered in the break room. They called her the Tank. They mocked her heavy breathing after a long flight of stairs. But what they didn't understand was that B's body was her armor. It had made her invisible to the cruelty of men, and in her line of work, being invisible was a survival tactic. St. Jude's wasn't a normal hospital. It was a discreet, highly illegal sanctuary for the New England underworld. If you had a bullet in your chest and a duffel bag of untraceable cash, St. Jude's was where you went to avoid police reports. At 2:14 a.m., the reinforced steel doors of the trauma bay blew open. The sterile quiet shattered as 5 men in soaked, ruined designer suits stormed in. They were screaming, dragging a stretcher between them. The metallic smell of fresh blood instantly overpowered the scent of bleach. "Get a fucking doctor right now!" roared a massive man with a jagged scar across his jaw. This was Leo Rizzoli, the brutal underboss of the DeLuca crime family. And the man bleeding out on the stretcher was none other than Carmine DeLuca. Carmine was a legend on the streets, a ruthless, calculated boss known as the architect of the city's underground empire. But right now, he didn't look like a king. His white dress shirt was completely soaked in crimson, plastered to a torso riddled with shrapnel and 3 distinct gunshot wounds. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. He was drowning in his own blood. Dr. Aris Kensington, the on-call surgeon, rushed into the room, wiping sleep from his eyes. But the moment Kensington saw the sheer volume of blood and recognized the dying man on the table, the doctor froze. Panic seized the young surgeon's hands. He dropped a pair of trauma shears, his eyes darting toward the exit. His lung is collapsed. The femoral artery is nicked. I can't, Kensington stammered, his voice cracking. Leo Rizzoli didn't hesitate. He pulled a suppressed Glock 19 from his shoulder holster and pressed it directly to the doctor's temple. "You save him, or I paint this room with your brains. Work!" Kensington's hands shook so violently he couldn't even thread the IV line. Carmine's monitor began to scream, a high-pitched, terrifying warning that his heart rate was plummeting. The boss was slipping away. "Move!" a calm, booming voice commanded. B stepped forward. She didn't cower from the guns, and she didn't look at the screaming mobsters. She shoved her heavy frame between the trembling doctor and the dying mafia boss, using her broad hips to literally bump Kensington out of the way. "Doctor, get to the other side and prep the chest tube, now!" Bee barked, her voice echoing with absolute authority. Without waiting for permission, Bee drove her thick, strong fingers directly into the gaping wound on Carmine's thigh, bypassing the surgical instruments entirely. She ignored the hot, click blood coating her forearms. She dug deep, feeling through the torn muscle until she found the severed artery. With a grunt of exertion, she clamped down on it with her bare fingers, using her significant body weight to lean into the wound, applying an immense, immovable pressure. "I've got the femoral. I need suction, and I need 2 units of O-negative hanging yesterday," Bee yelled at the paralyzed nursing staff. Carmine's body suddenly convulsed into a violent, shock-induced seizure. His eyes rolled back, and he began to thrash, threatening to throw himself off the narrow surgical table. The mobsters shouted in panic, but they didn't know how to hold him. Bee didn't flinch. She threw her upper body over Carmine's chest. Her soft, heavy breasts and broad shoulders pinned him down like a weighted blanket. "Hold his legs," she ordered Leo. Beneath her, Carmine's frantic thrashing slowed. Even in the haze of dying, he felt the crushing, warm weight pressing him to the table, forcing him to stay tethered to the earth. For a brief, agonizing second, his stormy, half-lidded grey eyes locked onto Bee's face. He saw her double chin, the sweat beading on her forehead, and the fierce, protective fire in her brown eyes. She wasn't looking at him like a monster. She was looking at him like a man she refused to let die. For the next 4 hours, Bear commanded the room. She was an absolute force of nature, her large body moving with surprising grace and brutal efficiency. She guided the trembling Dr. Kensington through the extraction of the bullets, managing the blood loss with mechanical precision. By 6 a.m., the bleeding had stopped. Carmine DeLuca was heavily sedated, stitched up, and alive. Leo Rizzoli lowered his gun, running a bloody hand over his face. He looked at Bea, who was covered from chest to knees in his boss's blood. She was panting, her scrubs sticking to her large rolls, but she stood tall. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Leo asked, his voice rough but laced with deep respect. "Beatrice," she said flatly, peeling off her soaked latex gloves. "And I'm not your sweetheart. Tell your men to stay out of my way. I need to wash my patient." 2 nights later, the atmosphere in the private penthouse recovery suite was suffocating. Carmine DeLuca had survived, but the betrayal that put him there was eating him alive. He had been set up by his own cousin. The hitmen had known exactly where he would be. Now, paranoid, feverish, and in agonizing pain, Carmine refused to sleep. He knew that the moment he closed his eyes, the shadows in the room would turn into assassins. He had fired his private security from the room, trusting no one, keeping a loaded revolver under his pillow. The sleep deprivation was making him dangerous. His heart rate was erratic, and his wounds were threatening to tear open from his constant restless pacing. Bee entered the dimly lit room carrying a tray of antibiotics. She had specifically requested this assignment. The other nurses were terrified of the mob boss who threw heavy glass vases at the wall whenever someone approached his bed. But Bea wasn't afraid. She had seen him vulnerable, stripped down to raw muscle and blood. "Mr. DeLuca," Bee said softly, her heavy footsteps announcing her presence. "You need your IV changed, and you need to rest. Your body is running on adrenaline, and it's going to crash." Carmine sat up in the oversized hospital bed. He was pale, his dark hair matted with sweat, his torso wrapped tightly in white bandages. He aimed the barrel of his revolver at the door, only lowering it slightly when he saw it was her. He recognized her instantly, the large woman who had crushed him to the table, the woman whose hands had felt like an iron vice stopping his blood from leaving his body. "I don't sleep," Carmine growled, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I close my eyes. I'm dead. They'll come back. Your men have the entire floor locked down. Nobody is getting in," Bee reasoned, walking over to the bed. She didn't hesitate or show fear as she reached for his arm. Carmine violently grabbed her thick wrist. His grip was bruising. He stared up at her, his eyes wet and bloodshot. "They got past my men once. They can do it again. I can't let my guard down." He was hyperventilating, the monitor beeping frantically in the background. Bee didn't pull away. Instead, she used her free hand to gently cup his face. Her hand was warm, soft, and remarkably steady. "Look at me," she commanded softly. "Breathe with me." To his own shock, the ruthless Mafia Don obeyed. He matched his breathing to the slow, steady rise and fall of her large chest. The panic began to subside, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull him under. "I need an anchor," Carmine whispered, his grip on her wrist loosening but not letting go. He looked at her waist, her wide hips, the undeniable physical mass of her. In a world of fragile, treacherous things, she looked like a fortress. "Sleep beside me," he suddenly demanded. Bee froze. "Excuse me?" "Get in the bed," Carmine said, his tone shifting from frantic to dead serious. "I'll pay you. Whatever you make in a year, I'll pay it to you in cash tomorrow. 10 times that. $1 million. Sleep beside me. I'll pay any price." Bee pulled her hand back, her cheeks burning with a sudden, humiliating heat. She was a professional, but more than that, she was acutely aware of her body. Men like Carmine DeLuca, rich, powerful, devastatingly handsome, did not want women who looked like her in their beds. They wanted the thin, blonde models they paraded around the city. "Mr. DeLuca, I am your nurse," Bee said stiffly, her defense mechanisms activating. "I weigh 280 pounds. I am not a stuffed animal for you to cuddle, and I don't fit in that bed with you without hurting your incisions. The answer is no." She turned to leave, but his voice cracked like a whip. "Beatrice, please." It was the please that stopped her. It was stripped of all mafia bravado. It was the plea of a terrified, broken man begging for a lifeline. Bee sighed heavily. She looked at the oversized bariatric recovery bed. It was large enough to fit them both, technically. Slowly, feeling utterly ridiculous, she took off her clogs. She didn't take off her scrubs. The bed groaned under her weight as she climbed in cautiously, keeping her back to him, curling her large body onto the edge of the mattress. She expected him to complain about the mattress sinking or her taking up too much room. Instead, Carmine shifted closer. He pressed his bandaged chest against her broad, soft back. He draped his heavy, muscular arm over her thick waist, burying his face into the space between her shoulder blades. She was incredibly warm. Her soft curves and solid mass absorbed his tremors. To Carmine, she didn't feel fat. She felt like safety. She felt like home. Within 3 minutes, the monitor showed his heart rate stabilizing. The violent Mafia Boss was dead asleep, clinging to the overweight nurse like she was his only salvation. Bee stayed awake, staring at the wall, her heart hammering in her chest. She told herself it was just for one night, a medical necessity. But at 3 a.m., the nightmare Carmine had predicted came true. The door to the suite clicked open. It wasn't the heavy, familiar tread of Leo or the security guards. It was a soft, calculated squeak of a rubber sole. Bee opened her eyes, her blood running cold. In the dim glow of the medical monitors, she saw a man in a janitor's uniform, but he wasn't holding a mop. He was holding a syringe with a long, wicked needle, creeping silently toward Carmine's side of the bed. Carmine was in a deep, medicated sleep. He wouldn't wake up in time. The assassin raised the syringe, aiming for Carmine's neck. Bea didn't think. All her life, society had told her that her weight was her greatest weakness, that she was too big, too clumsy, too heavy. In that split second, Beatrice Gallagher turned her weakness into a weapon. With a feral roar, Bear rolled over, throwing her entire 300-pound frame directly at the assassin. The impact was devastating. The man, who weighed perhaps 170 pounds, never saw it coming. Bear collided with him mid-air, her massive body tackling him directly to the hard floor. The breath exploded from the assassin's lungs with a sickening crack of ribs. The syringe went flying across the room, shattering against the baseboard. Bea didn't stop. Straddling the man's chest, she pinned his arms down under her thick knees. He struggled wildly, clawing at her face, but he couldn't move her. She was a mountain of flesh and furious adrenaline. She grabbed the heavy metal oxygen tank from the bedside cart and smashed it down against the man's temple. He went limp instantly. The commotion woke Carmine. He scrambled up, revolver in hand, his eyes wild as he took in the scene. The broken syringe on the floor, the unconscious hitman bleeding on the rug, and his overweight nurse, panting heavily, sitting on top of the assassin with a bloody oxygen tank in her hands. Bea looked up at Carmine, her chest heaving, a scratch across her cheek bleeding slowly. "I told you," she gasped out. "Nobody is getting in." Carmine lowered his gun. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a profound, earth-shattering realization. The women in his world were beautiful ornaments who would have screamed and run while he was murdered in his bed. This woman? This absolute titan? She had just crushed a killer to protect him. He looked at Beatrice, really looked at her. The soft curve of her double chin, the thick, powerful thighs that held the assassin down, the fierce, unapologetic fire in her eyes. In that moment, Carmine DeLuca didn't just feel gratitude. He felt a deep, primal obsession take root in his chest. "You're bleeding," Carmine said softly, stepping over the unconscious man and offering her his uninjured hand to pull her up. "It's just a scratch," Bea said, suddenly self-conscious again as she stood, smoothing down her wrinkled scrubs, acutely aware of how much she was sweating. Carmine reached out, his thumb gently wiping a drop of blood from her cheek. His stormy grey eyes darkened with a possessive intensity that made Bea's breath hitch. "I told you I'd pay any price for you to sleep beside me, Beatrice," Carmine murmured, his voice a dark, velvet promise. "But I made a mistake. You aren't going back to your apartment. You aren't going back to the regular rotation." Bea frowned, stepping back. "What are you talking about?" "My shift ends at 7. Carmine smiled, a dangerous, beautiful smirk that promised absolute chaos. "Your shift never ends, sweetheart. You just became mine." The transition from the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of St. Jude's Medical Center to the sprawling, high-security DeLuca estate in western Massachusetts happened in a blur. Beatrice didn't just move. She was transplanted. Carmine DeLuca made good on his word. The morning after the assassination attempt, a wire transfer of $2 million cleared into Bea's modest Bank of America checking account. But the money was merely a formality. The reality was that Carmine refused to let her out of his sight. For the first 3 weeks, Bea lived in a state of hypervigilance inside the stone mansion. She was given the master guest suite, but she rarely slept there. Every night, like clockwork, Carmine would appear in her doorway, his dark eyes shadowed with lingering paranoia, silently demanding his anchor. And every night, Bee climbed into his massive California king bed, letting her soft 300-pound frame become the wall between the Mafia Don and his demons. She expected the novelty to wear off. She expected the ruthless boss to recover from his gunshot wounds and cast her aside for a Boston socialite or an Instagram model. But Carmine's obsession only deepened. He didn't hide her. In fact, he paraded his heavy-set nurse in front of his capos. One brisk Tuesday afternoon, Carmine summoned a high-end personal stylist from Newbury Street to the estate. The stylist, a thin, sharp-featured woman named Vivian, took one look at Bee's wide hips and thick waist and immediately began pulling out black draped fabrics and heavy-duty shapewear. "We want to create an illusion of a silhouette," Vivian said, holding up a restrictive corset. "Something to slim the midsection and minimize the thighs. It's all about hiding the bulk." Bee lowered her eyes, a familiar, crushing shame tightening her chest. She had heard these words her entire life. Minimize, hide, shrink. "Put that away," a cold voice snapped. Carmine stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on a mahogany cane, his custom Tom Ford suit tailored perfectly over his healing bandages. His eyes were fixed on the stylist with a murderous intensity. "Mr. DeLuca," Vivian stammered, dropping the corset. "I was just trying to flatter her figure." "Her figure is a masterpiece, you vapid amateur," Carmine growled, limping into the room. He walked straight to Bee, wrapping a large, possessive hand around her thick waist, pulling her solid warmth against his side. She stopped a bullet wound with these hands. She crushed a killer with this body. You will not put her in black. You will not hide her. You will dress her in crimson, in gold, in fabrics that demand attention. If you ever use the word minimize in my house again, I will have Leo break your jaw." Vivienne fled the estate in tears. Bear stood frozen, looking up at the ruthless crime boss. No man had ever defended her size. No man had ever looked at her flesh as something to be worshipped rather than tolerated. "You don't have to pretend," Bee whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I know what I look like, Carmine." Carmine reached up, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her jawline. "You look like the only real thing in a world full of ghosts, Beatrice. You are my queen. It's time the rest of the city knows it." The opportunity to make that statement came a week later. Carmine was fully healed, and the syndicate was growing restless. Whispers of his weakness were spreading, fueled by his traitorous cousin, Matteo DeLuca. Matteo had vanished after the failed hospital hit, hiding in the shadows, waiting for his moment to seize the family throne. Carmine booked a private, highly visible dinner at Contessa, the lavish rooftop restaurant overlooking the Boston Public Garden. It was a power move. Bee wore a custom-made, deep emerald green gown that hugged her curves and flowed elegantly over her thick thighs. She felt exposed, yet undeniably powerful. As they stepped out of the armored Mercedes Maybach S-Class, flanked by Leo Rizzoli and 4 armed guards, the paparazzi and onlookers stared. They expected Carmine DeLuca to emerge with a supermodel. Instead, he held the door for a titan of a woman, offering her his arm with absolute reverence. Inside the glass-enclosed restaurant, the atmosphere was electric. Mob bosses and politicians alike covertly watched them. Bee sat tall, sipping a Barolo, playing her part perfectly. Then the lights cut out, The immediate pop, pop, pop of suppressed gunfire shattered the elegant ambience. Screams erupted. Glass rained down onto the velvet booths. "Down!" Carmine roared, shoving Bee beneath the heavy oak dining table as bullets chewed through the upholstery where they had just been sitting. The restaurant was a trap. Matteo hadn't fled the city. He had bought off the restaurant's security. In the chaotic darkness, lit only by the flashes of muzzle fire, Leo and Carmine's men engaged in a brutal shootout with Matteo's hitmen. The air filled with the thick scent of cordite and copper. "Stay here," Carmine ordered Bear, pulling his Glock from his waistband. "Do not move." But as Carmine flanked left to cover Leo, a figure slipped through the kitchen doors, bypassing the crossfire. It was Matteo, dressed in tactical gear, carrying a short-barreled shotgun. He bypassed the guards, his eyes fixed on the table where Carmine had left his prize. Bear saw his boots approaching in the dim light. She didn't have a gun. She was a nurse. But as Matteo rounded the table, racking his shotgun to execute her, Beatrice remembered who she was. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a survivor. Matteo sneered down at the heavy woman huddled under the table. "Look at what my cousin traded his empire for," he spat, leveling the barrel of the shotgun at her face. "A fat, useless cow. I'm going to do him a favor before I blow his brains out." He expected her to scream. He expected her to beg. Instead, Bee lunged. She didn't try to run away. She surged forward from under the table like a battering ram. Her 300-pound frame slammed directly into Matteo's knees. The sheer kinetic energy of the impact shattered his left patella with a sickening crack. Matteo shrieked, the shotgun firing wildly into the ceiling as he collapsed backward onto the hardwood floor. Bee didn't hesitate. The hospital instincts kicked in. Assess the threat, neutralize, control the environment. She scrambled over him, her heavy knees pinning his biceps to the floor, rendering his arms completely immobile. Her weight settled on his chest, crushing the air from his lungs. Matteo thrashed wildly, his eyes bugging out as he suffocated under her mass. But he couldn't dislodge her. "Get off me, you fat bitch!" he gasped, spitting blood. Bee calmly reached into the small, beaded clutch purse she had dropped on the floor. Amidst the lipstick and keys was a heavy, stainless steel, medical-grade scalpel she had carried in her scrubs for years, a habit she refused to break, even in her fancy new life. She pressed the surgical steel firmly against the pulsating carotid artery on Matteo's neck. "My name is Beatrice," she said, her voice eerily calm, cutting through the chaos of the room. "And you have a very irregular heartbeat, Matteo. It would be a shame if something caused your blood pressure to suddenly drop." Matteo froze, his bravado evaporating as the cold steel nicked his skin. The terrifying realization dawned on him. This woman wasn't a liability. She was a monster in her own right. The gunfire in the restaurant abruptly ceased. Carmine and Leo had neutralized the remaining hitmen. Carmine stalked through the smoke, his gun raised, his heart in his throat, terrified he was too late. He rounded the destroyed booth and stopped dead in his tracks. The sight before him would be burned into his memory forever. His beautiful, heavy-set nurse, her emerald dress torn, sitting triumphantly on the chest of his greatest enemy, holding a scalpel to his throat with the cold precision of a seasoned killer. Leo Rizzoli stepped up beside Carmine, wiping blood from his cheek. The hardened underboss stared at Bee in utter awe. "Boss," Leo muttered respectfully. "She's magnificent." Carmine lowered his gun, a dark, immensely proud smile spreading across his face. He walked over, his eyes locked on Bear. "Did he hurt you, Mia Regina?" Carmine asked softly. Just my ears, Bea replied, keeping the blade steady. What do you want me to do with him? Carmine crouched down beside them. He looked at his terrified cousin, then at the woman who had saved his life twice. You are the head of his medical care, Beatrice. It's your call. Bea looked down at Matteo, seeing the pathetic, cruel man who judged the world by its cover. She calmly lifted the scalpel, slipping it back into her purse. He needs a doctor, Bea said coldly, standing up and smoothing down her dress. But the hospital is an hour away, and with that shattered kneecap, well, I'm sure Leo can find a quiet basement to help him rehabilitate. Leo grinned, grabbing Matteo by the collar and dragging the screaming traitor toward the service elevator. Carmine stood, holstering his weapon. He didn't care about the dead bodies around them, or the sirens wailing in the distance. He walked up to Bea, wrapping his arms around her wide waist, pulling her flush against him. He kissed her, a deep, desperate, bruising kiss that tasted of smoke and absolute devotion. Marry me, Carmine commanded against her lips. It wasn't a question. Bea caught her breath, looking into his stormy grey eyes. Are you sure? A mob boss and a plus-size nurse? Carmine chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated against her chest. They'll write terrifying legends about you, Beatrice. You are my shield, my sword, and my only weakness. I'll pay any price, every single day, as long as you never leave. Bea wrapped her thick arms around his neck, finally letting herself feel the weight of his love. You couldn't get rid of me if you tried, Carmine. The Boston underworld learned a valuable lesson that night. Carmine DeLuca was the king of the city, a man of ruthless ambition and cold calculation. But the true power behind the throne, it belonged to the 300-pound woman who slept beside him. And she never left his side again. Did you expect that explosive twist at the end? Beatrice proved that true strength isn't about fitting into society's mold. It's about owning your space and fighting for who you love. If you loved this intense, thrilling mafia romance as much as we did, don't forget to smash that like button, share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking real-life dramas and epic romances. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below.